Good morning, everyone. When we started the book of Deuteronomy, I mentioned there are 270 laws in Deuteronomy. And you may be glad to know that we're not going to study all 270 laws in Deuteronomy. There are laws about so many things, so many intricate details. Do you know there are laws in Deuteronomy about what you do if you discover a bird's nest on the ground? There are laws about the kind of fabrics that you have to wear in your clothing. There are laws about, of course, what you can eat and what festivals you go to. There are laws about building houses and building extensions on those houses and the kind of framework that you have to put up when you're building extensions on your houses. There's a law in Deuteronomy 14, verse 22, that says when you plant something in your garden or in the field, and when you bring in some from the crop, whether it's grain that you're growing or whether it's vegetables or whether it's fruit or whether it's herbs, you have to give a tenth of that to God. And so for thousands of years, the Jews, when they did their gardening, when they were cooking dinner and they went out to pick some sprigs of rosemary to put on the roast, they would pick the leaves, and every 10th leaf would have to go to God. And when they wanted to make a nice water with mint kind of drink to go with their dinner, then they would pick the mint leaves, and 1 in every 10 leaves has to go to God. And when they would pick some cherry tomatoes from their garden, they would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 10th one goes to God. Or in reality, the first one goes to God and the next 9 go to us. And they did this again and again and again, so that when Jesus came along, he lived in a time where the scribes, which were the teachers of the law, and the Pharisees, which were the religious rulers, they were still trying to keep these laws. And they would still go into their little gardens, and when they would pick off their herbs and their spices, they would make sure that every 10th leaf goes to God. Every 10th sprig of rosemary goes to God. They were still focused on these laws of fabric, these laws about birds' nests, these laws about building extensions. And that's incredible dedication. And you would expect Jesus to come to them and say, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You really are listening to God's laws, aren't you?" You'd expect him to say, "Bless you, scribes and Pharisees, for keeping and honouring God's law." But what does he say? Matthew 23 and verse 23. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin." Why does he give a woe to people who are keeping God's law? There are lots of people in the world who are not keeping God's law. Why not rebuke them? Jesus usually blesses people. He rarely curses people. So we need to really pay attention when he gives someone a curse or a woe to them. Why? Why does he criticize them for keeping the law fastidiously? And we find it's actually not because they were keeping the law, it's because they were keeping those parts of the law and they were neglecting the other parts. He goes on and he says, "You have tithed mint and dill and cumin, and you've neglected the weightier matters." What Jesus is saying is that when you read the law, and the scribes should have known the law, that was their job, to know the law and to teach the law. He says, sure, you've got those bits right. You've got Deuteronomy 14 verse 22 in the bag. But Jesus is making an extraordinary claim here. He's saying not all laws are equally important. There are some laws that weigh more than others. He's not saying that you can neglect some laws. All of the laws are binding, all of the laws are important. He's saying some laws, though, are heavier than others. When Jesus was confronted by an expert in the law in the previous chapter in Matthew 22, and this expert in the law asked him, "What is the greatest commandment?" He didn't say, "How dare you?" All of God's laws are equally important. They're all great. No, he acknowledged there is a greatest commandment. There is one commandment that rises above the rest. More important than tithing herbs, more important than what to do with birds' nests. The greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then he throws in a freebie. You didn't ask for the second, but I'll give you the second too. The second greatest commandment is that you love your neighbor as yourself. And we sit there thinking, can you tell us the third and the fourth and the fifth? Could you rank them all, Jesus, into what the greatest is and what the least heavy is? The point of all of this is simply that all of the law was important and binding, but Jesus says some parts of the law should have carried more weight than other parts. And giving 10% of your herb garden to God was not the heavy part of the law. Sure, it was good that they were doing it. Jesus says you ought to have done the others without leaving these undone. He's not condemning them for following the law. He is condemning religious people for neglecting the weightier matters. And so this is the point where we go, so what are the weightier matters? And you know what? Jesus tells us what they are. Thank God that he tells us. Wouldn't it be terrible if he said you're neglecting the weightier matters and then we were left asking what are the weightier matters? But he tells us, Matthew 23, verse 23, you're neglecting the weightier matters of justice and mercy and faithfulness. Those are the weightier matters. 3 things he gives. That's the weight of the law that was given. And tithing kitchen herbs, that's lightweight stuff. This is the heavyweight law keeping that the law was meant to be about, that the teachers of the law and the instructors of the law, they should have seen that these were the weightier things. So this morning, instead of doing a lesson on what to do with birds' nests or how to tithe your kitchen herbs, we're going to do a lesson on the weightier matters. And I've selected a text that deals with the weightier matters. It's there in Deuteronomy chapter 10. And verse 12 to 22. And here's how I've summarized it. The first 2 verses is a plea from God to be faithful. Do you remember? Faithfulness, one of the weightier matters. In the next few verses, verses 14 to 16, it speaks about God's mercy. In verses 17 to 19, it speaks about God's justice. And then in verses 20 to 22, it comes back to a plea for us to be faithful. These are the weightier matters that Jesus said. The weightier matters are justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And this passage is directly dealing with the weightier matters. So, let's read through these verses again and deal with the weighty matters of the law. Let's start with verse 12 and 13. Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 12 to 13. It says, "And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? But to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments and statutes of the Lord, which I am commanding you today for your good." The entire book of Deuteronomy is a call for the people to be faithful to God. Deuteronomy is making a covenant. And just like in a marriage, you are calling both parties to be faithful to each other. And so God, all throughout the book of Deuteronomy, is telling them this is what faithfulness looks like. And, sometimes when the preacher gets to a point in his sermon and he says, if you only remember one thing, remember this. This is what Moses is saying at this point. If you only get one thing out of this whole book, what does God want? He gives you 5 things, and 2 of them are attitudes and 3 of them are actions. The 2 attitudes that we are to have is to fear God and to love God. And the 3 actions that we are to have is to serve God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments. Now, if you're reading through Deuteronomy, you'll have already got those because Moses has already told us to fear God 14 times, and he tells us to love God 8 times, and he tells us to walk in his ways 10 times, and he tells us to serve him 6 times, and he tells us to keep the commandments 65 times. 65 times. Keep the commandments. That's what faithfulness looks like. The Hebrew word there for keep is... it means to be careful, to pay attention. Do you remember the first time that word is used in the Bible? Do you remember when Adam was placed in the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and to keep it. That's the same word. Now, how do you keep a garden the same way that you keep a commandment? How is that the same word? How do you do the same thing to a garden as what you do to God's commands? Well, you look after it. You check when it needs watering. You prune what needs pruning. You pull out what needs pulling out. You are diligently aware and careful of it. We all know how easy it is for gardens to get away from us. We all know how easy it is for bushes to suddenly be twice the size that we want them to be, for gardens to be overgrown with weeds. Keep there means to be careful. When it comes to God's commands, we need to be careful. The opposite, of course, is carelessness. Ajith Fernando, in his commentary on Deuteronomy, he said, carelessness is the mother of sin, especially in the areas of our weakness. And that's true, isn't it? You can probably look back on your life as I look back on my life, and I can see where sin has crept up, and I can see how what started it was carelessness. I just wasn't paying close attention to what God wanted from me and what life he wanted me to live. So he asks us to be faithful by loving him and fearing him, by serving him, by walking in his ways, and by being careful about his commandments. Faithfulness is a weighty matter. Don't neglect the other matters, but be sure not to neglect what it means to be faithful to God. He then goes on and he speaks about God's mercy in verses 14 to 16. It says here, behold, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the heaven of heavens and earth with all that is in it. Yet the Lord set his heart in love on your fathers and chose their offspring after them, you above all peoples, as you are this day. Circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart and be no longer stubborn. Why did God choose the people? We went through this a couple of weeks ago. He didn't choose them because of their righteousness. He says, for you are a stubborn and a rebellious people. And even then, they weren't even a big nation. He could have chosen a much greater nation, a much more impressive nation. Look with me back in Deuteronomy chapter 7. Turn to chapter 7 with me. Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verses 6 to 8. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. It was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you. For you are the fewest of all peoples. But it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the land of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. God makes it abundantly clear in Deuteronomy again and again that they don't deserve this covenant that they've got. Now, could you imagine if you did that in your marriage? Could you imagine if you proposed to someone and you said, now I'm not choosing you today because you're a great person, because you are least in all the people of the earth. But God can do that. Because it's an act of mercy. You know, we don't marry people as an act of mercy. We don't marry people because we feel sorry for them and they're stubborn and rebellious and we marry them for their greatest good. No, but God is doing that with these people. He's showing them this supreme act of mercy. And he says back in Deuteronomy chapter 10, it starts with, to the Lord your God, in verse 14, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the heaven of heavens, the earth with all that's in. God owns everything, okay? He could have had anything he wanted, and he chose you, Israel. He chose you in a supreme act of mercy. Like what God says in Psalm 50 and verse 10, every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills is mine. God owns this whole world, and he chose little lowly Israel because of his mercy. Likewise, Who are we to be in God's service? Who are we that God has chosen to work with us, has chosen us to be his people? Because God has shown us his mercy, he asks us to go and show mercy. Do you remember what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 9 and verse 13? Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. When Jesus looks back on the old law, he sees lots of laws about sacrifice. But he sees shining through above them all, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. God doesn't show mercy reluctantly, and nor should we. Turn with me to the book of Micah. Turn to Micah chapter 7. Micah chapter 7, verse 18. Who is a God like you, pardoning iniquity and passing over transgression for the remnant of his inheritance? He does not retain his anger forever, because he delights in steadfast love. That's the word mercy there. That's that same word. God doesn't show mercy begrudgingly. Have you ever gotten two children to apologize to each other? And you say, now you say sorry, and they say, sorry. And you say, that's okay, I forgive you. That's okay, I forgive you. And you can see they're doing it because you're telling them. And their heart is not in it at all. You know, when God shows his mercy to the Israelites, when they fail and he forgives them, when they get trapped in all of their sin and he comes and he rescues them, he doesn't do it dragging his feet. He delights to show mercy. And he asks us to do the same. Go back a chapter in Micah to Micah chapter 6 and verse 8 to this famous verse. Micah 6 and verse 8, he has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness. That's that same word, mercy there. To love mercy, not just to do mercy, but to love mercy. It means that when someone wrongs you this week, whether it's a colleague at work or whether it's your spouse or whether it's your kids, or I'm sure you can think of someone who's going to wrong you this week. When that happens and when there's an opportunity for you and I to show mercy, when there's an opportunity where I can choose to hold a grudge or to complain about it or have bitterness in my heart, or I can choose to be like God and I can delight in mercy. I can say, you know, this person has hurt me and offended me, but I'm going to take joy in the fact that I can wipe their debts away. And God has taken joy in the fact that he can wipe my debt away. When we love mercy, we get a little taste of what God has done for us. We get a little taste of what it's like to cancel the debt of someone else and to love doing it. Mercy is a weighty matter. And finally, in Deuteronomy chapter 10, or not finally, number 3, in Deuteronomy 10, verses 17 to 19, this is about God's justice, another weighty matter. It says in verse 17 to 19, for the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribe. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Love the sojourner, therefore, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. How we choose to treat vulnerable and powerless people in our lives is a measuring stick of how closely aligned we are with God's will. Vulnerable people, whether they be children, people who have disabilities, the elderly, the migrant, the widow, the orphan, people who lack power and lack the ability to change their circumstances. How our heart responds to those people exposes whether our heart is close to God or not. Notice that it says there, God doesn't take a bribe. God doesn't take a bribe. Why not? It's because we can't bribe God with anything. He owns it all already. Can you imagine if you tried to bribe me by giving me something that I already owned? Daniel, you do me a favor and I'll give you your car. I'd say, I already have my car. I don't need my car. They say, you do me that favor, you give me this thing and I'll give you your money. And I would say, I already have my money. You can't give me something that I already have. You can't bribe God with things that he already has. And so God can't be bribed. He can't be bribed with our acts of righteousness. He can't be bribed with tithing kitchen herbs. We can't stand at the pearly gates and say, but look at all those times I went to church. But look at all those prayers that I offered for you. Did I not prophesy in your name? Did I not cast out demons in your name? And God can't be bribed. I can't pay anything to win God's favour. His favour to me is through his mercy, which is through my faith in Jesus Christ. The Pharisees were too busy trying to bribe their way to God that they missed the weightier matters like justice. And Jesus says, you devour widows' houses. You don't care for justice. You care about kitchen herbs instead. You think you can bribe God. Let's remember that when we stand before God one day, there's nothing I can do to bribe him. There's nothing I can give to him to change his mind. I'm dressed in his righteousness alone. And so it comes back at the end to one more plea to be faithful in verses 20 to 22. It says, you shall fear the Lord your God, you shall serve him and hold fast to him, and by his name you shall swear. He is your praise, he is your God, who has done for you these great and terrifying things that your eyes have seen. Your fathers went down to Egypt 70 persons, and now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the stars of heaven. Most of these things we've already covered before. This is a repeat of some of the things like to fear God, to serve him, but there are a couple of new things in there. One of them is that he says you have to hold fast to your God or cling to your God. Do you remember the first time the Bible talks about cling? It's when God gives Adam to Eve. He says, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And that same word is what God uses when he describes our relationship with him. You leave your father and mother, you leave the world behind, and you cling to your God the same way that you cling to your marriage. You hold fast and the two become one, just like with God, the two become one. He is your praise. He is your God who's done these wonderful things. So once again, be faithful to him. Faithfulness, mercy, justice. These are the weighty matters that Jesus talked about. John Tyson, he gave this illustration. I thought it was helpful. In 1972, there was a plane that departed from JFK Airport. You might have heard about it. It's quite a famous story. You might guess what happens in the end. The plane departed JFK Airport. It was flying to Miami. And as they approached Miami, they were coming in for landing, and the pilot put the landing gear down. Except when he did it, there's a little green light that should come on in the cockpit on the dashboard that says the landing gear has been locked into place, you know, the wheels and everything. And the light didn't come on. And so they pulled out of their landing and they decided, we're going to do some circles of the airport while we figure out, is the landing gear really down or is it just the light that's broken? I think it's just the light that's broken. It seems like the landing gear is down. And so the pilots are looking for, is the landing gear really down or not? And then the crew is coming in. They're saying, can you see, can anyone go down and check, is the landing gear down? And then bang, they crash. 101 people die. In the aftermath of the crash, when the investigators examined the plane, they found the landing gear was down. So they could have landed the first time. And everyone would have been safe. The reason 101 people died that day was because of one tiny malfunctioning light bulb. That was all it was. The light bulb consumed the attention of the pilots and the crew for just a few minutes. And they were so focused on fixing the light bulb that they forgot that their main job was to fly the plane, not fix the light bulb. They were so obsessed with fixing the light bulb, they didn't even hear the warning bells that told them that the plane was losing altitude. And I think Jesus' words are warning bells to us. I think we would do well to pay attention to the warning bells, to say you're focusing on a light bulb and I've asked you to fly a plane. In this congregation, we don't want to be people who obsess over broken light bulbs and forget to fly planes. We don't want to be people who obsess over small matters and neglect the weightier ones. We don't want to be people who have all of our kitchen herbs lined up and have forgotten about justice and mercy and faithfulness. Because I shudder to think that one day I will be standing before my God, thinking that I've done all the right things, showing off all my good deeds, showing off my attendance chart at church, showing off all my herbs that I've tithed, expecting to hear that blessing, expecting to hear, well done, good and faithful servant, and instead receiving, woe to you. You've tithed kitchen herbs, but you've neglected the weightier matters. We want weighty things to be weighty in our lives. So as we draw this lesson to a close, and as we think about how we can apply these things today and in this week, I want you to think about what are the weighty matters in your life and mine. For the Pharisees, kitchen herbs and picking grain on the Sabbath were weighty matters. We have our own things that are weighty matters, don't we? Lots of people love having a clean house. That's a weighty matter. Some people working out and dieting is a weighty matter. Excuse the pun there. For some people, having their kids get good grades is a weighty matter. For me, far too often, the approval of my peers is a much weightier matter than it ought to be. But Jesus says, here are the weighty matters. Here are the things that God cares about, and so should you. Faithfulness. Do I want to be faithful to God more than I want anything else this week? By loving and fearing my God, by paying careful attention to his commandments, by clinging closely to him, am I pursuing a life where I want to be faithful to my God? Mercy. Am I resting in God's mercy? Do I recognize that just like Israel, I am God's child in spite of all my stubbornness, in spite of all my rebellion? And do I delight in showing mercy to others? Am I looking forward this week to when people wrong me so that I can forgive them and show them the love and mercy of God just as he's shown me? Justice. Do I care for the vulnerable, the sick, the immigrant, the homeless, the poor? Do I recognize that caring for those who can't care for themselves is a weighty matter to God? May God bless us as we strive to keep the weighty matters in mind. I pray that when each of us stands before God, we can have put our faith in Christ Jesus and not neglected those weighty matters. Thanks, Gareth.